but in terms of interviewing, I just wanted to ask like some super simple questions about blockchain, just because
Yeah, please.
people keep asking me, and I don't have a lot of. First, I'm just going to ask like how you came to be working in blockchain and why you chose this and why.
Yeah. So, okay. So I was like a graduate student, and I was working on cryptography, which is related to blockchain. And my specific problem I was working on was voting technologies. And using cryptography so that if you cast a ballot, you can be sure that it counted, but you couldn't prove to someone else how you voted. So you can keep ballot secrecy, but still be mathematically sure that your ballot is in the final tally and it wasn't changed or modified or dropped. And so, yeah, and I worked with one of the people I worked with, his name's David Chom. And so he's kind of like an early cryptographer, and he invented this idea of cryptographic voting, but he also invented digital cash. And he tried to do like something kind of similar to Bitcoin back in the 90s. But unlike Bitcoin, it wasn't peer-to-peer. It was more like it used a lot of crypto. It was for digital cash, but it was in a sort of bank customer kind of architecture as opposed to decentralized architecture. So when Bitcoin came out, I was interested just because I knew his research on digital cash. And then when I read more about it, I realized it solved a problem that we were trying to solve in voting. And so I wrote a paper about it, just a short paper, but it ended up being like the third paper that anyone had ever written about Bitcoin. And so, yeah. And then as a result, people kept coming to me because like there were almost no academic papers on Bitcoin. And so I got involved in some early projects. And then I decided that eventually that you could actually, only do Bitcoin or blockchain research and still like have a good career. And so now I wouldn't say I only do it, but like 80-90% of what I do is blockchain. But when it first came out, you would have to fight to like get academics to recognize it as important or worthy of publication and things like that. But now there's like probably 1,000 papers a year published on Bitcoin or blockchain.
Why is it worthy of?
So we had to argue that it was novel, I guess. So it solved a problem that no one had solved. And even though it didn't solve it as like Satoshi Nakamoto, the inventor of Bitcoin, didn't write an academic paper, he could have. Like the contribution that he made was like publishable. And in fact, his white paper, which is not peer reviewed or published at all, has like, I don't know how many citations, but it has like gazillions of citations. Yeah. It's like one of the best, probably the most cited like crypto papers of the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm familiar with that. So how is blockchain different from the internet?
So first off, there was a small thing I would correct in your video, which is you sort of implied that if the internet went down, the blockchain could still exist or something like that. But a blockchain really is an internet technology. So it's like email. A more comparable thing would be like what's the difference between internet and email? Well, internet's kind of the platform that gets computers to talk to each other. And then email is like something that they might talk about. And so blockchain is something that internet enabled computers might talk about. So they so they'll run a payment system, but it uses the internet. So it's overlaid on the internet, and it's a specific system for doing certain things.
I think I was just getting excited about Blockstream and like the Bitcoin satellite thing, and like imagining like, I don't know.
Yeah. So there is like
people using like satellite phones and no internet, like journalists, like I don't know what I was imagining.
Right. But. No. It's actually probably a definition of internet itself. So like if you have satellite phones, is that still internet? So I would still consider that internet, but you could argue that it's not. Or if you had communication that was interplanetary, is that still the internet? Like to me, like any kind of networked computer is the internet, but you could argue that that's not the internet anymore. That's some other kind of, but it is a network of computers, right? So yeah.
Like kind of like the way the web was different from the internet, and then it just kind of became like interchangeable in people's minds, like kind of like that. Or
yeah, more or less. Yeah, exactly. So for me, like I don't know, sometimes people like the term intranet as opposed to internet. So it's kind of like a private internet. So you might have like a bunch of stuff in your home that talks to each other, but it's not actually connected to the internet, the internet, but they're still interconnected devices. I don't know. I'm sure there's people that have really good definitions, but I'm lazy, and so I just if it's a networked computer that's talking to other computers, I call it the internet.
So how is blockchain different from a database?
So a database typically has one owner, and that owner has all the power over that database. So if they disappear, the database disappears. If they want to change records, the records get changed. If they want to decide that you can't access or read or write to the database, then you can't read or write to it. A blockchain is like a distributed database, but like we also talk about distributed databases, which usually mean like 3 or 4 copies of your data, but they're kind of all owned by the same person. So distributed is more about like, in case, I don't know, there's a hurricane and your data center gets wrecked, then do you have the data somewhere else? So that usually is what we mean by distributed databases. But some of the problems are the same, like how do you make sure that they're all in sync with each other? And so the idea is if you can go from 1 to 5 databases and have them all synchronized, why couldn't you go to 1,000 databases or 10,000 like distributed nodes of this database? And so that's basically what blockchain does. And then a public blockchain, which would be like Ethereum or Bitcoin, they say anyone can be a database. Like if you want to join, we don't have to know anything about you. We don't have to know you're trustworthy. Like if you want to participate, you just join in. You can turn it on and now you're part of the database as well. So it's like those kinds of blockchains anyway are open systems. And so then you have like a very, very distributed, like decentralized database. And then the other difference is it depends on how strict you are about database, but I now will say like database / server. So database, I think of storing information, and then a server would like compute. And so a blockchain is both a server and a database, like in the sense that you can ask it to run computations for you, and you can ask it just to store information, and it will do both. A few more things. Databases are also usually for large information. So like storing like tons and tons of information, but blockchain, the information is usually really small. So it can only keep really small information, but the security guarantees over that information are large. So it's sort of like, you can also think of it as a spectrum between efficiency, scalability, and security and integrity. And so a blockchain, like the dial's turned all the way towards security integrity, but it's actually a terrible database in terms of how well it stores things, how efficient it is, how scalable it is, and things like that. And then if you have a single operator of a database, you can make it super efficient and super scalable. So Amazon, Google, they have very efficient databases, and you can do big data and you can do high throughput computation and all that good stuff. But the security is like you trust Google, and if Google's corrupt, then you can't trust anything.
Is part of why it's such a small amount is keep maintaining that like everything synchronized together at the same time?
Yeah, a small amount, you mean of data or of people?
Of data.
Of data, yeah. So the data tends to be very small on Bitcoin, or on blockchains in general. So like a payment, you just have to record Alice pays Bob this amount of money. So that's like a pretty tiny amount of data. But you couldn't put like a movie on Bitcoin's blockchain or something like that. So for you, like the question is, are the timestamps reliable? And the answer is, are they reliable down to the second? No. But are they reliable to the hour or to the day? Then yes. Definitely to the day, definitely not to the second. And then it's kind of probabilistic in between. It's kind of like you're 80% confident of the hour or something like that.
Because that could be relevant to like some kind of major breaking news event where it's like a minute by minute information is changing.
Yeah, exactly. Now you have the other problem with timestamping though, is that timestamping tells you that this is no newer than when it was timestamped, right? But it could be a lot older. Like maybe someone waits 5 years and then they timestamp it. So timestamping doesn't tell you how, it doesn't tell you how new something is. It just tells you it's newer than a certain date.
Yeah, but I guess I'm assuming if it's timestamped once, then every subsequent timestamp you'll be.
Yeah, exactly. So once you timestamp something, you know that it wasn't created after that timestamp. Like if I take a picture and I timestamp it, you know that it wasn't that it was created 5 days later and I somehow like back time the timestamp on it, right? but it still could be 100-year-old picture that I'm timestamping now, right? So usually if you want to like truly timestamp, you want something in both directions. So you want to say it's no newer than this and it's no older than this, right? So blockchain are really good for the one kind of bound. And you can do the other kind of bound. So this is like, like in movies where there's the ransom picture and they're like hold up a copy of today's newspaper or whatever. That tells you that the picture is no older than whenever that newspaper came into existence. So we have this concept, we call them beacons, which are like random numbers. You can actually use blockchains to generate them, or you could use stock data or something like that. But if you timestamp something with a beacon, right, it actually says, okay, this was timestamped. It couldn't have been timestamped any earlier than this because they wouldn't have known what the stock prices were on that particular day. And then the blockchain will protect it in the other direction.
Oh, okay. So it just includes some other piece of information that makes it so that you know that it was. Okay.
Yeah, that it's fresh. Now, that is only of the timestamp itself. It's not necessarily of the thing being timestamped. Yeah. Right. So still you could timestamp a picture.
Movies, when they go back in time, they're like, yeah, I'm really from the year whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
This team is gonna win the whatever.
Right. The Nobel Prize or whatever, yeah.
So I guess still on the topic of like things that could go wrong. I don't know, I was reading an article about NFTs or like digital collectibles and valuables, like people selling tweets, or I guess auctioning tweets or whatever. And then I was thinking about like, I don't know, okay, what's to stop people from making fake content and fake claims? I guess I'm proposing something that's free, really. So, I mean, I can think of ways it might be monetized, so there's not really an incentive, but what would stop someone from making like a fake claim or fake content because it would just generate more money or whatever? Right.
So nothing, basically. The only thing that stops it is whether someone's willing to buy it. So if people it's like fake art. It's like doing a painting that's a forgery, right? You can forge a painting, you can sell it, and the only thing that stops you is whether someone is willing to buy it. And
would there be some way to combine like provenance and fact checking, like both using blockchains? That is like some way to like say this was produced by the New York Times and this is the fact check that goes with it or something like.
Yeah. So like if you want to know the origin of things, like provenance is just tracking the origin of things. So the question is, what are the things that would be assembled in an article that you might want provenance over? So like images would be an example, and then facts are kind of hard because it's like if it was an exact sentence, you could be like, okay, this exact sentence came from this article, and you could track the provenance of it. But then that's kind of like plagiarism, and that's kind of like what you don't want. So like facts are kind of like, it's hard to say that, okay, here's the provenance over a fact, and this is the same fact that's in the article. There's a lot of like human, like a gap that the human has to fill in to say that, that fact as like tracked is the same as it's appearing in the article or whatever. But yeah. And same with data, like if you have data sets and things like that, you can have provenance over the data set.
Like advances in the speed of computing. I don't know anything about quantum computing, but like, how do you think that will change blockchain in the future? Like, what do you think will happen with blockchain like 20 years from now?
So blockchain, I think, is here to stay. Quantum computing breaks some of the security assumptions that blockchain uses, but they can be fixed. The reason they're not fixed yet is just because people think it's 20 years off or 30 years off, and they'll fix it later, basically. Why fix today what you can fix later, especially when you might have better solutions later. So yeah, and then it will get faster. So right now, like blockchain is kind of slow. It will just by definition never be as fast as the internet or databases, because you have to synchronize across multiple nodes, and that there's always going to be delays with that are just inherent to the design. So you're never going to get, it's always going to be, if you have 100 nodes, it's always going to be 100 times slower than just having a single node. And there's not really much you can do about that. But it still could, right now it's a lot slower than just like talking to 100 nodes like independently. Like it's thousands or tens of thousands times slower. So yeah, there is some room for growth. So I think you could get up to like a point where you would have 10,000 transactions per second or something like that, if you want to think in real concrete terms. Whereas a database could do maybe 100,000 transactions per second. So I think it will be like maybe 10 times slower than a database. But anyways, databases will also get faster. Servers will get faster. Machine learning algorithms will get faster. Everything's going to get faster over time. Blockchain will go along for the ride.
And what do you see as like the greatest dangers that blockchain could potentially say pose specifically to journalism?
I don't know that it does pose any. I mean, it poses. There are dangers it poses outside of journalism. Like basically, it lets you do things that normally would be heavily regulated and do it in an unregulated way. But for journalism, it doesn't seem to apply because journalism isn't really regulated anyways. I mean, it could disrupt the industry. So like from an economic perspective, you know, if there is the potential, but yeah, in general, I don't know. It just sort of democratizes fact checking, or at least it means like you can have one good fact checking system that works for everything instead of every like news organization having their own independent. You could just have one like kind of global fact checking unit that does everything.
Like kind of like Google is like, I mean, there's other search engines, but most people don't really use them. Like, isn't that kind of a bad thing? Or something that lots of people think is as a bad thing, like that kind of monopoly?
Right.
Like, does
So,
blockchain take that out of the equation because it's a bunch of different actors? It's not like really a monopoly because or I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So it's true. So you turn from like having, like, here's the thought experience. So you have a system and there's 10 people that run it, right? Or you have the system where there's one entity that runs it, but that entity is a consortium and the consortium has 1,000 members or whatever, but it's still one consortium. So is that a monopoly or not? So they're kind of different structures, and I don't know which one's better or worse. And people argue about it because Bitcoin mining is like that. Like now there's like 3 or 4 consortiums and they basically are a monopoly for Bitcoin mining. But the consortiums themselves are made up of thousands of members that could leave the consortium if they didn't like what the consortium does, right?
Well, I could see like a journalistic consortium like excluding certain areas of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
And I could see how that could be viewed as like a negative thing.
Yeah, and so then the question is, would the members leave the consortium because of that kind of thing, right? So consortiums are weird because they get a lot of power. Like, yeah, when they get that monopoly, they have power, but they also have to please the members of the consortium. Otherwise, the consortium people can leave. And blockchain consortiums are very easy to like leave and reorganize. So if you don't like what your consortium's doing, it's almost trivial to just start a new consortium and then everyone will pile on to that one. So I think you're still at the end of the day subject to like what the members of the consortium want. But the consortium too can like do things in subtle ways that like its members aren't really fully informed about what the consortium is doing and things like that. So that's a little more dangerous. But yeah.
So that's a private blockchain, and then a public blockchain, there's no consortium, right? Is that right? Or?
Yeah, well, no, I mean, like even Bitcoin mining consortiums are on public blockchains as well. So a private consortium is even worse. I think that's like a public consortium, a public blockchain has consortiums that are open, like anyone can freely enter and leave kind of thing, right? There's no gatekeeper or anything like that, and people can start their own. So it's a very agile system. A permission blockchain, you have a gatekeeper. So you have a consortium plus you have the gatekeeper. And really permission blockchains are like not that different than like just running a server, because like whoever controls the list of participants, they basically have all the power in the system because they can take you off the list and they can replace you with like 10 copies of themselves. And then they de facto become a centralized consortium. So yeah, so permission blockchains, they're always like, anyways, it's hard to sell people. There's a lot of pushback against them because like they have these centralized entities still in them. And so that's where you really question, like, why don't you just use a database instead of a blockchain?
whatever, Bitcoin at least had sort of a shady start. Like I forget what the statistic was, but it was like the vast majority of transactions were Silk Road for like a chunk of time. Like most of it was illegal activity in the beginning.
Right.
So is that like a barrier to adoption, or will there be like, or
Yeah.
do you think it will become more regulated? Do you think it will like?
It's definitely a
or
barrier
won't be
to it.
adopted until it is, or?
I'd say it's a barrier to adoption for Bitcoin itself because of that reason, but not necessarily to blockchain, which is the technology that underlies it. And I like speak a lot at the federal government in Canada, and everyone's like, they're like, okay, come, but like, don't talk about Bitcoin. We don't want to know about Bitcoin. We want to know about blockchain. Like, we don't like Bitcoin, but we like blockchain, kind of thing. And
But
so,
can't you do the same thing with any blockchain?
sort of. So if it's a
If
permission
it's encrypted,
system,
like you don't know what the transaction includes, like, can it?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess if it was permissioned, then there would be some control over it. But if it's some public like cryptocurrency, then it's true. Like they all could be like the same as Bitcoin, unless if they had some like regulation built in, like from the start. But none of them do. So like, and yeah, the only reason that Ether might be more clean than Bitcoin is just because there's more productive things to do with Ether than there is to do with Bitcoin. But yeah.
When you can still do illegal things like not on a blockchain, like
that too. Yeah. So if you want to talk about like the worst offender, like forget about Bitcoin, think about paper bills, like cash. Like now almost everyone uses like debit or credit cards. And so the cash use that's left is largely criminal activities like drug trade things, or tax evasion. So like you're paying someone in cash because you don't want to have a paper record of the transaction, usually to evade tax. And everyone knows that, the Bank of Canada knows that. That's why they got rid of the $1,000 bill. So at least when you're doing cash transactions, you have to give like a big pile of hundreds instead of like a small pile of $1,000 bills. But yeah. And eventually, like there is speculation that they'll eventually get rid of the $100 bill, and like maybe we might only have like $1 or $2 like in physical cash, just to like
which would be
stop
hard.
that kind of activity. Yeah, if you're doing $1 million transaction in cash, you'd have to have like
in toonies or something.
in toonies, yeah, and think of how heavy it would be.
So I guess still on the topic of like things that could go wrong. I don't know, I was reading an article about NFTs, or like digital collectibles and valuables, like people selling tweets, or I guess auctioning tweets or whatever. And then I was thinking about like, I don't know, okay, what's to stop people from making fake content and fake claims? I guess I'm proposing something that's free, really. So, I mean, I can think of ways it might be monetized, so there's not really an incentive, but what would stop someone from making like a fake claim or fake content because it would just generate more money or whatever?
Right. So nothing, basically. It's the only thing that stops it is whether someone's willing to buy it. So if people it's like fake art. Blockchain. It's like doing a painting that's a forgery, right? You can forge a painting, you can sell it, and the only thing that stops you is whether someone is willing to buy it. And
would there be some way to combine like provenance and fact checking, like both using blockchains? That is like some way to like say this was produced by the New York Times and this is the fact check that goes with it, or something like.
Yeah. So like if you want to know the origin of things, like provenance is just tracking the origin of things. So the question is, what are the things that would be assembled in an article that you might want provenance over? So like images would be an example, and then facts are kind of hard because it's like if it was an exact sentence, you could be like, okay, this exact sentence came from this article, and you could track the provenance of it. But then that's kind of like plagiarism, and that's kind of like what you don't want. So like facts are kind of like, it's hard to say that, okay, here's the provenance over a fact, and this is the same fact that's in the article. There's a lot of like human, like a gap that the human has to fill in to say that, that fact as like tracked is the same as it's appearing in the article or whatever. But yeah. And same with data, like if you have data sets and things like that, you can have provenance over the data set. But then the hard part is like, how do you know the article is accurately representing the data set? right? Like you're like, oh, the GDP of Canada is blah, 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 blah. And then there's this data set and it's huge and there's all these numbers and like, can you find the GDP? And it's not called GDP because there's like 5 different ways of calculating.
Well, I thought that could be another good use, would just be like, instead of just only fact checkers checking or only editors checking facts, you could have like super specialized, like people with super specialized skills checking facts or checking algorithms or checking whatever.
Right.
But or like scientific data, like checking, or like, you know, an article about something that's super scientific.
Yeah. So that's a good idea because that actually goes into well, it relates to prediction markets. So prediction markets are these like, they don't have to be a blockchain system, but it's like a blockchain system where it's like a betting market, basically, like who's going to win the election. But you need someone to say, oh, Joe Biden won the election in the US, right? Like someone has to put that information in. And it's kind of obvious, but like who's going to put that information, who's going to validate it. And it might be obvious in the US election, but it's not so obvious for like the MP of, you know, like wherever in Montreal you are or whatever, like, because it's not like common knowledge or whatever. And if it's an election in Nigeria and the information's only recorded in one newspaper, but that newspaper is in Ugo, it's not even in like English, and like, you know, like how am I, the validator, going to know that? Like I'll look at the Wikipedia article and I'll just say what the Wikipedia article. So you have lots of validators that aren't actually like validating the raw information, they're validating it in some digested form. But so there is that idea of like specialists, and you might have people who just specialize in like validating basically this data for prediction markets. And there are systems that use that, and then there's other systems that do like general crowdsource voting, where they vote on what's right and what's wrong. And that stuff is actually, now that I think of it, that's kind of close to what you're doing. Like it might be close enough that it might be worth taking an hour or two to look at those projects. But like, if you want blockchain prediction market, the two biggest are called Augur and Gnosis. But yeah, anyway, so you could have specialists that specialize it. Oh yeah, and then the other thing is what incentivizes them. So that was what the prediction market had a hard time solving. So like how, like, yes, I could sit and enter information to resolve these markets, but why would I? Right. And so like, you could be like, well, why does anyone edit Wikipedia? Right.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like they're bored, and like Clay Shirky has like a bunch of ideas about that and stuff like that. Like but
or I guess
anyways.
if you're like, it's like thought leadership marketing, I don't know, or like a way to like, if you're like, whatever, some doctor and you are providing like super specific medical advice to like well-known newspapers, that could be a more time efficient than like actually writing an article too.
Yeah, sure. So you could disseminate your ideas quicker. It could boost your profile or your reputation. So those might be like non-financial benefits to doing it. And then the other thing you could imagine is like actual just financial benefits. So you could have like, you could have it be kind of like an auction where people are like, hey, I want this fact checked and I'm willing to pay, you know, $1 like for this. And if enough people pay it, then that gets to kind of the top of the list. And that's where the fact checkers, they just kind of go through the list from top to bottom. But then the problem there is, how do you know that the fact, like before you pay the fact checker, you have to make sure they did their job. And no one knows what the answer is, because that's the whole purpose of fact checking.
Would micropayments maybe make more sense? Because an auction to me, it would be like incentivizing, or there would be like the possibility of incentivizing people to lie or falsify things if they could say that
so
you could get some fake source to verify something, because like really quickly. And
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you could collect the payment first, so that would make it kind of an auction. Micropayment would be like, hey, maybe we fact check this or not, and if you pay, you can find out. Or it could be a model of tipping, where you're like, at the end, you're like, oh, that person fact checked it, that was really useful to me, let me tip them.
Or a subscription model where it's just like,
yeah. So that would be the micropayment model.
Would like, I don't know. I mean, it's probably cheaper than hiring. Like most news organizations don't have fact checkers like for a long time, and like significantly reduced editorial departments. It could be like a cost-effective sort of subscription-based thing that you just join and belong to, and then. But
Right.
It sort of seems like it would be hard to reconcile it being like, I don't know. It seems like if you were incentivizing people, there would be more of a likelihood of like, I don't know.
Yeah, committing malicious acts or whatever.
Behavior or whatever.
Yeah. I agreed. But yeah, writing about that would be interesting.
Do you think anybody would participate in it if it was free? Like just like Wikipedia, like just based on like.
Yeah, because of Wikipedia, I think you would get a certain number of people that would do it.
Does this make sense? I don't know. I feel like this is an idea I had.
Yeah,
a long time ago, like over 10 years ago, and then never did anything about it. And then, so it was like, I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't know if this is.
It does make sense. Like other people are doing stuff in this vein, right? So that should be like, yeah. If you email Vicky too, you can.
But it seems like not that many. Like it seems like if it was a good idea, it would have already been done, or there would be more happening with it.
Perhaps.
Do you think of any other like reasons why it's a bad idea?
It depends on what the idea is. Like if the idea is like some fact checking and verification and validation of it, that's a really good idea. If it's like, I have to use a blockchain, that's like the weakest point where like someone might say, oh, you don't really need a blockchain, right? You could do that with just like you have some company and they say we fact checked it and they provide some certificate that says it and there's no blockchain anywhere. So that's the only point. But I don't know that you have to marry yourself to a blockchain either. Like you're working out what the requirements would be for a fact checking system. And then once you work out the requirements, then you're going to see what like kind of technology platforms fit. And if you can prove that you don't need a blockchain, that's as interesting as designing a system that uses the blockchain, right? So your job is like more neutral. You're evaluating the claim that a blockchain is useful. You're not here to sell someone that like some product that's based on a blockchain. What
is your opinion of putting actual content on a blockchain?
So there's not
enough.
That's
what WordProof does, right? Like.
Yeah. Well, sort of. So I think they probably just put like hashes of stuff, which sounds like not an important distinction, but it ends up being somewhat important. So like you can use the blockchain to trace, like sort of do the provenance over the data, but there's not enough storage on a blockchain to actually store actual data. Unless if it was just text, but even still text can get pretty big. Like Bitcoin's like 5. Say again.
Sorry. In the future, would it be possible to store like movies or audio or is that never gonna?
I think it's a never thing. Maybe it's possible, but the problem is that like movies get bigger as systems get faster too, right? So like now you get like 5K videos because your internet can handle 5K, right? Whereas 10 years ago, so the video is always like the maximum size that your internet can handle, right? So as the internet scales, as the system scales, then, and then it's going to be virtual reality and 3D and the files are going to get bigger and bigger.